This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo. I'm Matt Addison with Paul Gorst, David Lynch and Sean Bradbury alongside me this afternoon with plenty of stuff to get stuck into. Jordan Henderson's contract, priorities with other new deals, the latest on transfers, some pre-season games being lined up at Anfield. All of that is to come over the next half an hour or so on what should be a jam-packed edition of the podcast. Gorsty, I'll come to you first. Jordan Henderson's contract has kind of gone a little bit under the radar up until today. He is inside the last couple of years of his deal, but lots of speculation to get stuck into. First and foremost, so what do you make of the situation that seems to be unfolding?
Interesting one, isn't it? The initial thoughts were a bit of a storm in a teacup, and the initial piece which came out this morning from the Athletic, I thought was almost a typical thing where a lot of it was taken out of context, and next thing you know, you've seen Henderson linked to PSG and Atletico Madrid, and the fan base are in a little bit of a meltdown. And I thought that seems to be the situation here. He's got 2 years left on his contract, and probably not the type of character to ever agitate for a move or anything like that. So I initially thought that was the case, and then you see a few other reports coming out from journalists who I know for a fact are really close to Jordan, actually, and I think maybe this is, a little bit more to it than perhaps I initially thought. I don't for 1 second think that Henderson's going to be leaving this summer. He's got 2 years left on his contract, and I think, I don't know this to be true, but just reading in between the lines, possibly what I feel that this might be is Henderson's got, I'd say, a couple of years left on his contract, and he might know or be reading reports of a whole host of other players in line for new contracts. We've written about it across the course of the summer, haven't we? Fabinho and Alisson, Van Dijk, Salah, Trent, Andy Robertson. And maybe he's looking at it thinking, well, I'll be 33 by the time my contract's up. Perhaps I could be or should be in line for renewed terms and maybe just another extra couple of years security, and maybe that is what this boils down to. But I don't know really. It's difficult because I think Henderson is not the type to rock the boat. So maybe this is all being done through his representatives and talk behind the scenes and so on. But it's a very interesting one, which I don't think anyone would have ever seen coming. What are we on now? It's about 12 hours ago, shall we say, and it's all thrown a few things up in the air.
Yeah, it's certainly not something we expected David to be talking about today. It's kind of come a little bit out of the blue. And as Gorsty says, to lose Henderson this summer would be a bizarre one, not least because they've already lost Gini Wijnaldum this summer. To lose both of them in the space of one transfer window is surely unthinkable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's sort of, as you said, really in the intro about the idea that Henderson's contract has gone under the radar in comparison to some others is absolutely right in terms of, that was almost a clue really, wasn't it? That things aren't quite right in terms of negotiations there. For example, Fabinho and Alisson, we expect those to basically a case of them putting pen to paper when they get back to pre-season. Obviously a little bit delayed because of Copa America, but I think those are quite far down the line. Those are the first couple of contracts they expect to get signed, and Henderson really hasn't even been mentioned in the group behind that. We talked about Van Dijk and Salah and how important it is to get them tied down, but Henderson, he hasn't really got a mention. And I think, the most sort of damning line in there, in terms of some of the reports, is the idea that the contract talks had already started and that Henderson's representatives weren't happy with what's been put down. So that suggests there is a real issue. This is quite a big issue, something, problem that Liverpool have got to solve, and for the player to think or to feel, or at least his representatives to feel that they need to put this information out there to sort of put a bit of pressure on Liverpool is slightly worrying, considering he's the club captain, he's achieved so much, he's such an influential figure in the dressing room, and also an absolutely top class player, which I think sometimes doesn't get mentioned amid all the talk around how big an influence he is around Liverpool. He is an absolutely phenomenal player, and a player, by the way, who I think, I know he's 31 now, and with, it becomes a bit difficult, doesn't it, to agree contracts when you get to that age, because of you're essentially giving him a contract for a period of decline, and that makes it tricky. But I think he's a player with the skill set in terms of controlling football matches that extends beyond, even if he loses a little bit of mobility, he can do that exactly what Gerrard did in terms of that deeper role and control in football matches. I'm not comparing him to, say, Luka Modric or Toni Kroos, but for example, they're two players who've used their intelligence to sort of mask a lack of pace later in the career, and I really think Henderson is capable of doing that. So it's not great for Liverpool for these stories to be out there, because there's been a disagreement there and now it's been made public. I think what you've seen from the reaction is that it's worked. If you're Henderson's representatives, you're looking at the fan reaction there and thinking that it was worthwhile doing this. And I think FSG are now under massive pressure to sort of fix that impasse and make sure they get this tied up, because I just don't think they can afford, not just in terms of losing Henderson for what he brings on and off the pitch, but in terms of what that would do to their reputation among Liverpool supporters. I just don't think they can afford to lose him.
Yeah, we talk so much, Sean, about his influence off the pitch, on the pitch, captaincy, leadership. Has he almost been taken a little bit for granted in that regard? Do you think it was almost just assumed that he would stay?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think that comes into it. But I think, like the guys have said, that what I'd point to there is just the amount of players who in 2023 have their contracts expiring. And that's where I have some sympathy with the club and the people who are sitting around the table and doing these negotiations and coming up with the order of priorities, because it's not just Henderson, is it? It's Salah, it's Mane, it's Van Dijk, Fabinho. I think there's a couple of others. There's Oxlade-Chamberlain, Keita maybe, whose deals expire in a couple of seasons' time. So that's not an enviable task, is it? To sit there and decide, well, who do we negotiate with first? What's the kind of top level of salary reset? What are the expectations? What happens to the guys who are a little bit further down the pecking order? So I think, like Gorty said as well, the fact that this has become public, you do see this happen, don't you? You see agents and representatives and people kind of on the peripheries of situations put stuff out into the public domain through whatever means to try and further an agenda. I just don't for a minute think that that's the type of person that Henderson is. But the fact that it's got to this stage does suggest that it is a bit of an issue. But I think when you see it to flip it and look at it from Henderson's perspective, he is 31 now. Every season that ticks by, his hand is probably a little bit weaker in terms of getting a decent deal through. And I think, if I was Henderson's agent and he's got a job to do, hasn't he? As every single agent does. I know sometimes they're not the most popular figures with fans and those who assess the game, but if they look at what happened with Wijnaldum and how Liverpool played hardball and seemingly from the outside at least didn't budge on the situation, were quite firm on what they were willing to do, and obviously we all saw how that played out. If you look at the fact that a midfielder there though has just left, you look at the fact that Henderson's stock is high, you look at the fact that if he was to leave this summer, which I agree with Gorty, I don't think that's going to happen, but you'd be losing another member of the leadership group and the foremost one at that, the club captain. If you take all that together, I can see why, from the Henderson perspective, forcing the issue a little bit now, it's perhaps the right thing to do, to try and get a contract through that would see him stay at Liverpool for the rest of his career. And, that would not be without justification. Like the guys have said, he's a Liverpool legend, isn't he? He's been an absolutely incredible captain. I'd say he's got an argument now to perhaps be the greatest captain of the modern Liverpool era, with the obvious influence that carries in terms of Gerrard. He's been a fantastic servant, and wouldn't be surprised if there was a statue of him outside Anfield one day. But yeah, it's just so difficult, isn't it? As much as you want to see that loyalty and that quality of Henderson rewarded, and someone who's just such a positive influence on the pitch and off it, you never really want to see them leave. But at the same time, FSG have got other priorities and other perspectives, haven't they? That their priority is Liverpool and what happens around the squad, and sentiment and emotion are things that are obviously integral to football and fandom. But in the cold light of the kind of business environment where these financial decisions get made, it is very, very difficult. So yeah, I can kind of see from both perspectives as to how it's got here. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how it plays out.
Just to come in, on Sean's point about a lot of contracts expiring in the same summer and that being sort of unfortunate. To be honest, I think FSG should sort of carry the can for that a little bit. I think that's, we talk a lot, don't we, about how good they are in terms of the planning. But this summer's been coming a long way away. You know, they put themselves in this situation. You know, I know some of the renewals, for example, I think I'm right in saying Sadio Mane signed his in the middle of a season, but it was agreed that it would begin at the end so that it would run to the summer because they wanted contracts to run in that way. So there was no sort of, you know, contracts weren't disjointed and they could deal with them every summer. So they basically put themselves in this situation, is ensuring that everyone's contract ended at the same time, and they would have to make some really tricky decisions. They obviously made one already with Gini Wijnaldum in terms of his expiring this summer and not extending beyond that. And so, yeah, they've sort of put themselves in this situation. I think, you know, for an organisation that we talk so much about how meticulous they are and how much planning they do, I think that's, you know, a little bit of sloppiness, to be honest, and they've put themselves in this situation.
How much do you think that the situation, Gorsty, of Gini Wijnaldum would have played into this from Henderson's sort of perspective? I suppose he's got that example to say, well, it's not always the case that the ones that you think would be obvious would actually get these deals. Yeah,
I think so, definitely. I think that was a big example, isn't it? You know, was one of his closest teammates and a player who was so important and vital to Liverpool last season. And Henderson's looking at it one step removed. I'm not, you know, we don't know how kind of privy Henderson was to the negotiations with Wijnaldum and his team, but everything that Wijnaldum said about that particular, you know, the way it was handled was very cryptic and coy. So maybe Henderson was looking at it thinking it might have been a no-brainer at one point, and he's ultimately ended up leaving on a free transfer and thinking, well, if it can happen to him, it can happen to me. And there's an argument to be made that perhaps Henderson's probably a little bit more kind of up the pecking order, if you like. But I do think that might have some kind of sway in his thinking at the moment. And also, you've got to look back at in terms of how he was given the captaincy and how Steven Gerrard's exit was handled. You know, that just kind of was announced like 3 months before the end of the season, wasn't it? Back in 2015, and then Gerrard kind of just limped to a bit of a meek conclusion to an otherwise, you know, iconic career. And maybe he could have played another year at Liverpool, and I think he's gone on record as saying that himself. You know, if he would have stuck to his guns or you know, signed the 1 year contract, he would have played under Klopp. So maybe those two are the big striking deals that Henderson's looking at, thinking, you know, if this can happen to Steven Gerrard and Gini Wijnaldum, then why would I be immune to a similar fate? So possibly, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But yeah, I'm not too concerned at the prospect of Henderson leaving this summer.
Do you think, Sean, there's a kind of, obviously, you mentioned Steven Gerrard yourself there before, there's going to be that in his mind as well. There is a kind of precedent for FSG making these sorts of decisions, not necessarily this summer, but if Henderson was to run his contract down, for example, he'd be sort of 33, 34 at that point. I mean, as you said before, it does kind of make a little bit of business sense. They would argue that it sort of makes sense in terms of the wider transfer strategy, trying to, you know, upgrade the squad and keep, you know, everybody happy, everybody young and that sort of thing. Does this kind of work into that wider thing? Do we sort of look at it with a little bit too much emotion attached to it almost?
I think so. There's an element of that. I mean, look at it, captains, you know, you could probably go back a lot further than Gerrard in terms of looking at Liverpool captains who didn't see out their career at the club. I mean, it's a very, very tough ask, that, isn't it? If you're a Liverpool captain, obviously, coming with that is the fact that you're a very, very good footballer. But also, you know, you're a very, very proud one. And when it gets to the stage where you might not be playing week in, week out, you know, other midfielders perhaps are coming in to give you competition, which I think that's a key thing, isn't it? Surely, before Henderson's contract does run out in its existing form, Liverpool will have beefed up their midfield a little bit, because he's not the only aging midfielder in the squad, is he? You know, there's Milner, there's Thiago, there's the kind of core, apart from Fabinho, the core players who you're expecting 30 plus Premier League appearances from every season are getting on a little bit. But yeah, going back to the captaincy point, you know, Suey, Phil Neal, Emlyn Hughes, they all left, didn't they? Arguably kind of in their prime, and they still had, you know, time to give on the pitch, and Gerrard was the same. And I think it just points to how difficult a decision it is all round, really. You know, do you stay and kind of fade out a little bit, and potentially in this circumstance, do you do so on a salary that would be a little bit less than you might get if you go elsewhere, or do you push for that move and go and try something different? I think just the Wijnaldum point, though, is the comparison I'd focus on here. And it's difficult saying this, but I'm more worried right now about Wijnaldum leaving and the state that leaves Liverpool in than I would be about Henderson's contract running down, if that makes sense. Because, Liverpool right now have got so many minutes to replace in terms of Gini Wijnaldum. And like we said before, it remains to be seen whether a midfielder comes in. I mean, at the very, very least, the plan has to be put in place as to how you're getting 3,000 minutes from the current squad. And, I'd be, if it was up to me, there definitely would be a midfield signing, and I'd imagine there will be. But yeah, I mean, Henderson, if he was to go or to push for a move, that's obviously the worst possible situation. But I think it strikes me a little bit as these conversations are guided by the Wijnaldum, situation and how that played out. Because would this be happening now if the Wijnaldum situation hasn't happened? I'm not sure, because this is happening a little bit earlier than all the chat about Wijnaldum, and his situation really kind of reached a crescendo, didn't it? So we will see. But yeah, there's no doubt he is still a very important player. I mean, think back to last season. We were all desperate to see that midfield, weren't we, of Fabinho, Thiago and Jordan Henderson. And that's the one you want to see in the friendlies and at the start of this season when everyone's fit to get Liverpool off to the best possible start. So yeah, a real dilemma. And I'm, as I said before, not envious of those who are involved in sorting it out.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it, Lynchy? I mean, the fact that Paris Saint-Germain and Atletico Madrid are being linked with him just sort of reminds you of that point that he is an elite level footballer. And if he was to be lost, and obviously he will be at some point because he's not going to be around forever, it will be a difficult player to replace. It's not just a case of, we need to sort of freshen things up. Getting a player to do the same job as what Henderson does is actually a really hard task in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the PSG and Atletico links, I do think you've got to sort of see those as well as a little bit of I've no doubt they have some interest in a player of that quality, and will be keeping tabs on him. But the sheer cost in terms of wages and transfer fee that would be expected to get Henderson out of Liverpool as things stand with 2 years left on his contract, I'm not sure how big the likelihood is that they would follow up on that interest. I think that's slightly then being used as leverage. But you're absolutely right to say that he's that level of midfielder, and that Liverpool were to resign themselves to losing him this summer, it would be a huge deficit in the squad they have to fill. Not only the fact that, as Sean points out rightly, that replacing Gini Wijnaldum is hard enough in itself, just in terms of pure availability, and I think it just underlines how important it is that Liverpool do something in that position in terms of the transfer market, because they're already missing one huge leader and quality player in there. So yeah, to lose another would just be absolutely devastating.
Let's move on a little bit then, Gorsty, to a few of the other a few of the other players, I should say, who are in a similar situation to Henderson. That long list that Sean referenced before, as well as Henderson. You look at Van Dijk, Salah, Mane, Firmino, Fabinho, Chamberlain and Keita, all in that same situation of having 2 years left. I mean, the sort of wording from the reports this morning was that Henderson isn't necessarily a priority. And from that perspective, you'd look at, say, Van Dijk and Salah in particular, and that does kind of make it a little bit of sense from Liverpool.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know whether it's just Henderson's been overlooked because it's always just going to be assumed that he's going to be staying. And Liverpool will be wary of making that mistake. And certainly with the stories that have come out today, maybe this might just give them a little bit of a kick up the backside if that was the intention. But also I think because Henderson's been around for 10 years, he was literally just celebrated his 10-year anniversary at the club, hasn't he, last month? Whereas you think about Van Dijk and you think about Salah and Alisson, and these are all relatively new players, aren't they, in the eyes of Liverpool fans? 3 years at most. Alisson was signed, what was it, 3 years today? So, yeah, maybe that is part of the thinking, and maybe Liverpool have got a kind of batch of players who they want to get resolved, and then they'll move on to a second batch, and maybe Henderson's in that. We don't really know, do we? All we know is what we understand to be true at the moment, that Liverpool are targeting the likes of Fabinho and Alisson, as we say. But yeah, maybe this is the kind of Henderson's way of I don't know. I'm reluctant to use the phrase "rock the boat" because he's not that type of person. But maybe this is just his way of floating a little reminder towards the club and the people who make these decisions that look, these players aren't the only ones with just a couple of years left on their own deals. I'm still here. I'm the captain, and perhaps I need to be moving up the priority list a little bit. And if that is the case and it does kind of get resolved as a result, then you have to say that probably the right decision, isn't it? But it'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on anyway. But when all the other players are signing their contracts as expected in the next month, 2 months, however long it takes.
In terms of the sort of order of it, Sean, do you think maybe there's a case that, for example, Mohamed Salah might be one that happens a little bit later on, because you'd imagine he'd set a precedent in terms of how much it might cost, and then that obviously has knock-on effects for other players as well. Is there a kind of, well, there is undoubtedly a much bigger job this summer because Liverpool have left it so long with all of these players, but is there a kind of order that they have to do these things in order to make it cost-effective almost?
Yeah, I think that there's the cost-effective factor, but also I just think if you look at fairly recent recruitments of the forward line, obviously Jota's come in, so you could argue that he's the first one of the next generation to have been brought in. In defence, aside from Van Dijk and I suppose Matip as well, it's relatively young, isn't it? Konate's come in as well, and that's excellent. That's a player for now and also for the future. I mean, I can see why Word has come out saying Fabinho is right up there now in terms of the immediate priorities, because realistically, he's your midfield linchpin, isn't he, for the next 2 or 3 seasons, or hopefully beyond. He's only 27, so you can see why you'd want to get him done. I think Alisson as well would be right up there as for my money, probably the best goalie in the world. Someone for whom Liverpool paid a world record fee. So I think it again goes to the cost effectiveness. It's a difficult one, isn't it? And I always wonder how things play out in that regard in terms of the dynamics of the squad, because everyone must know that contract negotiations are happening, and it's obviously very public when people do sign a new deal, and managing that, I think, is a whole different and very interesting psychological thing to happen within a football club. But there's certain players, I'd say, for whom you can probably make the case that they could be an exception, and Alisson would be one. I'd say if he was paid a little bit more than most of the squad, they could probably deal with that. I think Salah would be another. Van Dijk, perhaps, if it comes to it and he gets a new deal, which everyone would want because he's another one whose contract runs out fairly soon. They're all there. But Henderson, it's just so difficult, isn't it? Because he's that little bit older than all these guys, isn't he? People were talking about here, okay, Van Dijk's 30, isn't he? But Alisson, Mane, Salah are all 28 or 29. So I just think that couple of years does put a totally different complexion on it. And, from Liverpool's perspective, they can say to all those players, well, look what's just happened with Gini Wijnaldum, and that's them playing hardball at the other end of it and letting the deal run down. So, yeah, I'd say Fabinho, probably Salah, probably Alisson would be the ones that, if I was in that boardroom, I'd be looking to tie up ASAP.
Who'd be your priorities, David? I mean, I think Van Dijk and Mane are 2 interesting ones. Mane in particular, after the season he had last season, maybe wasn't quite as good, but if he gets a new contract over the next couple of months, then I suppose that's Liverpool saying, well, we think he will be back to his best sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, do Liverpool think that decline is going to sustain, or do they think it really was just a blip, a really busy season in a team that was struggling? And is that the reason for his sort of slight dip in form? By the sounds of things, they don't think that at all. I think in terms of priorities, out of all those contracts, I think Sean is right to mention the ages, really, in terms of, because of Alisson, I know he's a little bit older, but you can goalkeepers go on for such a long time, don't they, that you can imagine him being a mainstay for, even if you give him a 5-year contract, you can imagine him playing a huge part over each of those. I think Fabinho, with him being a little bit younger, is very similar. Salah, the shape he keeps himself in, and the form he showed last season doesn't show any sort of signs of slowing down. So I know that that really through the spine there is where I think your priorities lie. And I think Mane is probably one of the more difficult ones to judge, and I think that is where Henderson will be looking and saying, well, I possibly did more than Mane last season in terms of my level of performance. I know he had that injury towards the end, but didn't really drop off in terms of his performance levels. Plus, he was filling in at centre half and doing really well there. So would maybe be looking at that and saying, well, that's not quite fair that he would maybe be ahead of me in terms of priority, and maybe would be justified in saying that. And so perhaps that's why he's felt the need to sort of make a fuss almost and point out that he's he should be deserving of a contract too.
think the other interesting angle, Gorsty, that we've not mentioned as well is that Liverpool's wage bill is the second biggest in the Premier League, behind only Manchester City. They've got all of these deals to do. It's a financial decision as much as anything else, isn't it, as well? I mean, I think it went up 15 million in the last accounts. You'd expect it would go up a significant amount more in the next set of results.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. I'm not sure how much of that is obviously incentivised, but if it was, then Liverpool have been paying out quite a lot, haven't they? Because this team's been quite successful over the last 2 years. But yeah, it's that's an interesting aspect, isn't it? Because Liverpool don't pay the kind of fees regularly, at least that Manchester City pay and Manchester United and Chelsea. But then the wages are very comparable. I think is it only City who pay more in wages in the Premier League. And when you think of some of the money that United and Chelsea pay out, look at the players who Chelsea bought last summer. They spent the best part of 200 million, so that's going to bloat your wage bill, isn't it? And United seem to try and sign a superstar every window who's going to be on 200 grand minimum. So yeah, Liverpool really in that high end for wages, and I suppose that helps when you're looking to bring a player in. You can kind of compete with some of the big guns in the division and in the world football. But then the upshot of that is that Liverpool don't routinely pay the fees, do they? The transfer fees if they're paying the wages. So yeah, it's a tough one for Liverpool because, as we say, they're not kind of awash with cash with the way that the other three teams that we just mentioned seem to be. City and Chelsea, it's obvious where their funds are coming from, but United is kind of from a sustained period of excellence across 20 years, isn't it, really? And that's why they're able to bring in the likes of the Sancho, seemingly every summer. Liverpool have to work a little bit more strategically and think about things with a little bit of more clarity and a long-term thinking. But they shouldn't be taking their eye off the ball with the players who are already at the helm, and that seems to be something that they're wary of with the new contracts for whoever it may be. But perhaps Henderson thinks he should be in that conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Matt.
Liverpool. Sorry, go on, mate. Go on.
Sorry, I just think that it's a really interesting test of FSG and their model this at the moment, because I think they were perfectly suited to doing what they did, which was dragging Liverpool from outside the Champions League, trying to make smart transfers, picking up players just before they turned them into superstars under a manager who was capable of doing that. Bringing them in on wages which weren't superstar wages because they hadn't reached that level yet, and then obviously they got there, they got them into the Champions League, they got to the final, they kicked on, they won trophies, they won the Premier League as well, and then started handing out contracts to keep hold of these superstars. Now the big next test then is, okay, how do you start this process of building your next great team whilst you also want to sort of keep hold of these superstars? To do this part of the model, do you need to sell some of your big players? Does that have to happen for you to refresh the squad? Because you're not Manchester City, you're not Chelsea, you don't have endless limits up to transfer funds and ability to pay huge wages. So it's a really interesting test, because if they will they be able to renew all these contracts and still keep that refreshing going? Bring in your next Diogo Jota, whether in midfield as well, and refresh there, bring in some younger legs there as well, and be able to keep your wage bill sustainable. We don't really know that yet. That's why this summer is so interesting, because they're trying to do both those things at once, it seems, and maybe that's why there's a little bit of discord there in terms of some of the negotiations, because they realise that's extremely difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Plenty for Liverpool and FSG to think about. But just before we finish the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about some friendlies that are coming up. And Gorsty, I'll come back to you first. There's been some news of some Anfield friendlies being arranged today. What's the latest on there?
Yeah, so 2 friendlies announced today. Liverpool are going to be playing Athletic Bilbao. And then, just a little over 24 hours later, going to be playing Osasuna, aren't they? In a tribute to Michael Robinson, who obviously played for both clubs and sadly passed away last year. Not a kind of new way of working. Liverpool did this in 2016, didn't they, when they played Barcelona at Wembley and beat them 4-0, and everyone was saying that they're going to win the Premier League, and then 24 hours later got beat by Mainz by the same scoreline in Germany. So I think it's a case of basically Liverpool having such a big squad now with Klopp's out there with 36 players, isn't he? And going to be getting an extra 3 or 4 over the next couple of weeks. Keen to see as many of them as you can before decisions are made and the kind of final preparations are done with regards to the first game against Norwich on the 14th of August. But I think Liverpool are keen to have a little bit of a test event as well, with reopening the doors to Anfield to 75% crowd, which will be the biggest crowd at Anfield since March 2020 against Atletico Madrid. And if you can do that, if they can do it on the Sunday against Athletic and then the Monday against Osasuna, then it'll give them a big chance of pulling that off without too many hitches when they come to host Burnley later that month. So, it's something that they've been keen to do, get as many fans in as possible so fans get to see them in action. It's been a while, hasn't it? Let's face it. And, they go from there. So an extra 2 friendlies on the to-do list for Liverpool, and I think that might be the last of their pre-season games.
Yeah, a logistical test, if you like, Sean, for Anfield and all of the people who work there. But it'll be interesting for Liverpool and for Jurgen Klopp as well. I would imagine that players like Jordan Henderson, Thiago Alcantara, who've been late to pre-season training, that'll be a big couple of days for them potentially as well. Just a week, of course, before the new season begins. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's been a little while coming, hasn't it? Getting the final schedule announced, but now it's all there. Yeah, I think it's quite exciting. There's lots of things to look forward to, and I think you're right. The big guns kind of coming back into the squad is one. It's interesting, really, isn't it? Because I do think Liverpool have got quite an advantageous situation, and the fact that it's played out how it has with this month-long camp, where a lot of other stars are already there, and they've been there since the start, haven't they? And for Konate, obviously, is another one we're all excited to see, and potentially that'll happen this week, won't it? With these 2 half-hour games and the others that are to come. But it's just great, isn't it? It feels like, certainly compared to last season, there's a proper bit of preparation time. Klopp's got something that he himself has said he's never experienced before with this lengthy training camp. And then now we've got these games, particularly the ones at Anfield, to really look forward to. But yeah, just loads I'm looking forward to seeing. Looking forward to seeing Joel Matip as well after his little dribble around Konate and lovely finish the other day. See if we can get a bit more of that out of him. But yeah, just everything really. Just I suppose some of the players, like Wilson, Williams, Grujic, I suppose Origi, Shaqiri, whether they feature or whether they don't, I'll be quite instructive as to what's going to happen with them, I suppose, over the next few weeks. Formations as well. I mean, I think one thing in terms of what we've been talking about with midfield and midfield recruitment, do wonder whether Liverpool might have a little look at 4-2-3-1. We only saw it for flashes last season, didn't we? But if there isn't another midfielder coming in, I think that could be something that we see a little bit more of. So, yeah, keep an eye on how the team shapes up as well in these friendlies. But, yeah, all of a sudden, plenty of football to look forward to, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 games on Tuesday night, Lynchy. Innsbruck and Stuttgart, 30 minutes each. Be interesting to see who's picked in those games, though, because you wouldn't imagine there would be loads of subs in those games. And with 34 players to pick from, it's a pretty big squad.
Yeah, I think we can expect two completely different sides just to give everyone that sort of first little run out in pre-season. And I'll be interested to see if they allow fly goalie while it's just like little half an hour games that we're doing, sort of mix the rules up a little bit. But yeah, that'll be quite nice to see, because I think, the fact you are going to see 2 different teams, you're going to see 2 different sets of players, see how everyone's getting on in terms of the sharpness. And yeah, it's just like, our first opportunity this summer to sort of clap eyes on the players again and see how they're warming up for the new season. So, excited to that.
Any particular players that you think Gorsty would be particularly looking forward to Tuesday night's games? Is there anybody there that needs to make an impression, particularly early on?
No, I don't, actually. I think probably Joel Matip, if he, as Klopp was saying the other day, he seems to be the one who's made the most progress out of the 3 centre-backs. His injury, obviously, a few months after Van Dijk and Gomez, and perhaps a little bit less serious. So he'll be looking to get some minutes under his belt. Konate, he's going to make his debut in one of them, isn't he? So he'll be looking forward to that, I'm sure. And then the likes of Harvey Elliott and Matty Musialowski and Kate Gordon, they'll be absolutely dying, won't they, to just get the foot on the ball and get a few minutes and rub shoulders with some of the more senior stars. So plenty to keep us occupied, isn't it, over the next couple of weeks. It's a bit of a strange situation to back-to-back friendlies at half an hour each, and then the one against Mainz is only an hour, and then finally they'd be playing 90 minutes against Hertha, don't they, before the end of the month. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see the two teams that line up in both of those games tomorrow, and plenty, as I say, to keep our eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. Plenty for Liverpool to think about heading into next season and, of course, beyond that too. We'll bring you all of the details on transfers, contracts and much more as they come in across the summer and beyond, both here and across on the Liverpool Echo's website too. From myself, Matt Addison, Paul Gorst, David Lynch and Sean Bradbury, though, until next time here on the Blood Red channel, thanks for joining us and goodbye for now.
This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo.